Taking you to Philadelphia, we'll be seeing history come alive because this is where America began. It was here that it was first declared that America should be free and independent from Great Britain. This was the intellectual, political, economic center of the country at that time. Philadelphia was the capital of the United States from 1790 to 1800, and at that time it was also the economic center of the country, with thousands of beautiful buildings constructed, many of which are still standing today. In this segment, we'll visit Independence National Historical Park. Most famous for Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. It's also where the Continental Congress met, and all of those great luminaries came together. Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Adams. It's where we first formed our government with the creation of the Constitution. And the buildings are still standing. And it's all free because it's a national park. And you can hear the park rangers tell you all about it with their historical descriptions of what happened here back in the late 18th century.
You are now in not only in Independence National Historical Park, but you are now in Independence Hall. Now, the actual name of this building truly, though, was known as the Pennsylvania State House. This building first started construction in 1732, with the initial part of the building finishing in about 1735. This building did house all three forms of government for the colony of Pennsylvania, and there a room right across the way that we'll be heading into here in a little bit. That would have been where the legislature would have met, and out in the assembly room. Upstairs would have been the governor's offices. The American Revolution was an idea. It was a change of social political thought. I believe that we are still under the idea of the American Revolution today.
We'll hear more of the Rangers talk later in the segment. The park was established in 1956 and designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979. The grounds of the national park are a delightful series of small gardens and squares that further enhance the experience as you stroll from one site to the next. Everything is contained within a 5-block area, so it's very easy to walk around. Even if you are unable to get a ticket for an interior visit, by all means come down to the park and enjoy the outside of these grand buildings. The park is quite busy year-round, especially in the summertime, so you do not want to just show up without a ticket. It's free to walk around the outside of the buildings. No reservations are required for that. However, you do want to go inside and hear those wonderful talks and see the interior. For that, you need a ticket. It's a free ticket, and the best way to get it is go online to the National Park Service website. You can easily Google Independence Hall reservations, and you can get your ticket online. There's a $1 service fee at this time, but that's nothing. The ticket itself is free, and you pick your date and time of entry, and you can get right in. If you show up without a reservation, especially during the busy periods, you might find you'd have to wait 4 or 5 days for an opening to get in. So by all means, plan ahead online. This park offers one of the greatest travel bargains and experiences in the world because you get to walk through these historic buildings, beautifully preserved from 200 years ago, and listen to knowledgeable park rangers, all funded by U.S. taxpayers. The centerpiece is Independence Hall, where the great debates leading up to our Revolutionary War took place. The rooms have been brilliantly restored to their original style in a mix of Georgian and colonial architecture. This is where the two founding documents of our nation were adopted, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The other major building to see here is Congress Hall, which was the capital of our country from 1790 to 1800. Congress met here for the first time and created the Bill of Rights. You'll see the original House and Senate chambers, which are preserved exactly as they were 200 years ago. It's also where Washington and John Adams were sworn in as president. These few small buildings contain the totality of our national government offices. Quite a difference from today's vast bureaucratic expansion.
The tour of these buildings is an amazing lesson in living American history. It's awesome to think that this is where it actually happened, in the original rooms, in the original buildings.
America ripped itself away from England here in that long summer of 1776, with the great minds of our revolution coming together to declare our independence. Another one of the popular attractions here is the Liberty Bell. It's the symbol of America's independence. It cracked once, they fixed it, kept ringing it, and then it cracked again. Now it's a silent testament to freedom. Another of the most historic buildings here, which is often overlooked, is Carpenter's Hall. For here's where the first Continental Congress met and issued a list of grievances to the English king. The Carpenters were among the town's most important people, for this was the largest and fastest growing city in the colonies. The small historic building is still owned by the Carpenters Company. It was constructed in 1770 as headquarters for the Carpenters Guild, so you can believe this is a very well-built structure. The Carpenters were among the town's most important people, for Philadelphia was the largest and fastest growing city in North America. The small historic building is still owned by the Carpenters Company. A volunteer guide explained what happened here.
Some of the more famous occupiers, or the most famous occupiers of the building, were was the first Continental Congress, which met here for 6 weeks in 1774. So they came here to kind of decide what their response to Britain would be. They didn't like what Britain was doing to Massachusetts and Boston, and they certainly didn't want Britain to do those kinds of things to other colonies.
But they hadn't quite decided yet to break from Britain.
Exactly. This was more of a testing the waters, in a sense, for everyone.
Right. And then they all dispersed back to their states.
They dispersed back to from whence they came, and decided that they were going to return in May of 1775. They come back in May of 1775. April 1775 are Lexington and Concord. The idea of resolution now has kind of jumped a little bit more towards revolution. And they move over to what was then the State House, which is now Independence Hall, in May. And then in July of the following year, declare independence.
1 block away, you'll come across what looks like an ancient Greek temple. But it's the Second Bank of America. It was built between 1819 and 1824, and it's a great example of the Greek Revival style of architecture, based on the Parthenon in Athens. By 1841, it was no longer a bank because of political struggles between President Jackson and his opponents. Now it functions as an art gallery, part of the National Park Service. Open with free admission to the collection that's mostly portraits. The park is just 10 blocks from City Hall, making it very easy to walk here. You don't need a taxi or a bus to get down to Independence National Historical Park. And the buildings we visited in this segment are all clustered together within that oval outline. Now we're going back inside Independence Hall to learn some more of our American history from the park ranger.
It is kind of interesting that we do start our tour here in a courtroom, because more than anything else, if we look back on the events that took place in the 18th century, especially leading up to the American Revolution, we know that most of the things that people were clamoring for, fighting for, were these ideas of rights. Rights that they believed that they were being taken away from them. Most of this starts after the year 1763, after the French and Indian War is over. It was a major battle, international conflict, that we see Great Britain winning this war, but a lot of the fighting was fought here in the North America to protect the colonies themselves. After this war is over, we have Great Britain is now in a massive debt that they need to recuperate this for the money that they are needing. So what they end up doing is they start instituting a series of taxes. Now, here's the thing, though. The colonists here in the Americas thought that they were not being adequately represented when these taxes were being levied upon them. They thought it was the average right of the English citizens to have representation in order before any laws, especially taxation, was going to be placed upon them. This comes to the idea of what we talked about, this idea of no taxation without representation, right? This is a war slogan that ended up moving on throughout the 1760s and into the 1770s. The important part, though, wasn't necessarily just the taxation part, it was the representation part. If we look at the Declaration of Independence, there's actually 27 separate grievances that the colonists laid against Parliament and the King. Of those, only one time actually is taxes mentioned. More things to the effect of juries by trial, for example, and other rights and privileges that we believed that were given to every English citizen. We started understanding that maybe some of these rights were not given to us as American colonists. So we start putting forth passive protest in order to try to redress some of these issues, mostly in written forms of petitions sent to Parliament and the King. We do this throughout the 1760s and into the 1770s. But we start realizing that some of our voice really was not being heard, so much to the point where we have to start having more active protest. One of the biggest active protests that we see in the 1770s takes place in 1773 in Boston. The royal governor announces that no ship would be allowed to leave Boston Harbor until the tax on tea was paid. So one night, a group of men known as the Sons of Liberty dress up as Native Americans. They board all the ships in Boston Harbor and dump over 342 boxes of tea into the harbor. This event, of course, became to be known as, anyone? You guys are on it, yes. General Gage then closes the port of Boston, puts the city of Boston under martial law. General Gage in 1775 hears about a cache of weapons that are being held outside of the city. He wants to make sure that they're not going to be used against his soldiers. He sends a detachment of men out there to go seize these weapons and ammunition. On their way, they are encountered by American militia about the towns of Lexington and Concord. Now, we're not exactly sure who fired the first shot of this engagement, but we do know that it was this engagement that started the American Revolution, and according to the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, this was the shot that was heard around the world.
Then we move from the courtroom to the other side of the building where the ranger continues his talk, now about the Second Continental Congress. This is the room in which they declared independence.
It's actually been stated that this building, Independence Hall, is probably possibly one of the most historic buildings in all of the United States. If this is true, then this room is probably one of the most historic rooms in all of the United States. This is the assembly room for the Pennsylvania legislature. Now, one of the first things that happens in 1775 is they elect John Hancock to become the president or presiding officer of Congress during this time period. Shortly thereafterwards, they start hearing about some of the events that took place in Lexington and Concord. Now, the delegates in this room knew that no one militia would be able to stand up against the might of the British military. At this point in time, Great Britain had quite possibly one of the most powerful armies and navies in the world at this point. If we were going to stand any chance of defending ourselves, we need to have a Continental Army. So they look over to the Virginia table. There's a very tall, charismatic gentleman sitting there. The only man in the room, actually, who's wearing a military uniform at the time. The delegates in this room unanimously elect George Washington to become the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He then immediately leaves to go fight in the siege of Boston. Now, it would take another year before we actually declare independence. This first year of war can almost be considered a war of reconciliation to some. The idea is that many people believed we could still actually resolve our differences with Great Britain and come back to being one empire. These debates went on not only in this room, but all over the country. But during this next year, into 1776, we start seeing this shift of attitudes and changes and going towards this idea of independence. So much so that in June of 1776, there's a man by the name of Richard Henry Lee who stands up in this room and states, "These colonies of right and ought to be free and independent states." They appoint a committee of 5 men together in order to draft a declaration in the event that the resolution passes. Of those 5 men, we have John Adams from Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, Robert Livingston from New York, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, and can anyone tell me who the 5th member of the committee was? Anyone?
Thomas Jefferson.
It was Thomas Jefferson, that is correct. Thomas Jefferson was actually voted in the committee to be the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He then spends about 2 weeks developing the document, taking ideas from other constitutions that were being developed during this time period by the states, also taking ideas from English common law, from the Magna Carta. Eventually, after some edits in Congress, or in the committee, it is presented to Congress on June 28th. The handwritten signed version of the Declaration of Independence, that is in the National Archives, was not signed until August 2nd, a month later, in this room. That we could have a government that was of, for, and by the people. He says, in order to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. What Jefferson was saying was the power rested in the people. It was the people that had all the power, and they gave the power to everyone else above them. Radical idea. On September 17, 1787, 39 delegates signed their name to the Constitution of the United States. It would take another year before it was finally ratified by the requisite number of states. But on July 2nd, 1788, 12 years to the day after we had voted for independence, we now have a new form of government that's the same form of government we still have today. Since the adoption of the Constitution, we have had 27 separate amendments that have altered this document and addressed such issues that have plagued us as far as social injustice is concerned. Things like women's rights, the removal of slavery, the removal of poll taxes to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to vote, even lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, so more people have the power to shape the government that shapes them. We are still part of the American Revolution, and that maybe one day we will actually figure out what Jefferson was trying to say, that everyone is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the end of my formal presentation, everyone. Well, what's going to happen now is we're going to go ahead, we're going to probably start heading out through this north exit right here. I'm going to go ahead and stand up by the exit, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you guys have about any of the things we've discussed or any things maybe I haven't discussed. I'm glad that everyone was able to come in today, and I hope you learned something and stay safe out there. Have a good day, everyone.
We frequently upload new movies, so please subscribe to our channel and click that little alarm bell so you'll be notified. And if you enjoyed the movie, how about a thumbs up? And we always welcome comments down below. Or if you have questions about the destination, make note and we'll answer them. Thanks for watching.